Decatur Book Festival is a nonprofit. It depends on sponsors and donations to bring great authors to Decatur each year. Please consider a tax-deductible donation to support the festival by going to the festival website. Lastly, please take a moment to ensure that all device ringtones are turned off. Now, please allow me to welcome our panelists. Moderating today is Deb Miller-Landau, who is the genre-bending author of A Devil Went Down to Georgia, Race, Power, Privilege, and the Murder of Lita McClinton, a book Oprah Daily ranked number 1 on his list of the best true crimes of all time. Deb's book has been featured in Atlanta Magazine, People, Newsweek, NPR's All Things Considered, and was a finalist for a 2025 Edgar Allan Poe Award. Wow, it's pretty impressive. Yeah, give her a round of applause. Ann Hite has written 6 novels set in Black Mountain, North Carolina, and 2 nonfiction books. Her short story collection, Haints on Black Mountain, won bronze in the 2022 Forward Indies Book Award. Her first novel won the Georgia Author of the Year Award, and she's been shortlisted for the Townsend Prize 2 times, finalist for the Georgia Author of the Year 3 times, and nominated for the Pushcart 3 times. Another impressive.
Yeah.
And we also have Joshua Sharpe. He is a print and audio journalist and editor whose stories have helped free 2 innocent people from life in prison. He is a 2025 Type Media Center Fellow, a 2023-2024 Knight Wallace Fellow, a Livingston Award winner, and a 2022 and 2023 Pulitzer Prize judge. Please welcome our panelists.
Well, thank you very much, Amy, and thank you to you all for being here this afternoon. I know you have a lot of amazing choices, so thanks for joining us. And I want to say congratulations to Joshua and Ann for writing 2 incredibly meticulously researched books, 2 books that are deeply Southern, that are deeply part of our Southern history. And writing a nonfiction, true crime book, nonfiction or otherwise, not true crime or otherwise, is a ton of work. So congratulations to both of you. Thanks. So one of the things that, these are, 2 quite different books, but there are a lot of similarities, and that's where I kind of want to focus our conversation today. And the first sort of piece I want to talk about is kind of perspective. And you both have written books that give voice to people who didn't actually get much of a voice in their journeys, in their lifetimes, and in relation to the stories that you're telling. So, Anne, I'm going to start with you. I Am a Georgia Girl is about Lucille Frank, who is, of course, the widow of Leo Frank, whose 1915 lynching is a deeply polarizing story, and still is today. But we've really rarely heard about his wife, Lucille. So why is telling Lucille's story important?
Well, when I was 9.5, I came home from Germany. I'd lived there pretty much my whole life and came to live with my grandmother. And one of the stories that she told me was at 6 years old, she was taken to see Leo Frank's body hanging from a tree. That sounds like, we wouldn't do it, but it was a very common thing to do back then. Everybody put on their Sunday clothes and they went out and seen whoever it was that was being lynched. They didn't actually see him lynched, but they saw him afterwards. Right around 1,000 people in Marietta that day came out to see him. So that started it for me. It was, at 9.5, I thought, how can people do that to each other? And I still say she told me about it because she wanted me to remember, in the hopes that somehow or another that I would have a voice about it. I don't know, maybe not, but I'd like to think that.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think it's Lucille's side of the story is important?
Well, women were marginalized big time in 1913. And if you read anything about her in any of the books, Steve Oney does the best, but most of them, she was hysterical. She was, just your typical what they thought women were. They didn't give her a voice. And so for me, when I started researching, I thought I have to do this as nonfiction because, as you heard, I do mostly fiction. I have to do this as nonfiction because no one knows about her. They don't know what she's done. They don't know how at 26 years old, she stood up and fought for her husband and fought for the belief that he was being railroaded. And so it just seemed natural. And, I thought, okay, I'm going to write a nonfiction book. And so it was a learning curve, it was a learning curve, but I enjoyed it.
If only all of the stories in history could go back and look at the women's perspective.
Exactly.
I don't know if y'all know, but women didn't exist in history for most of it. So anyway, that's another conversation. Okay, Joshua, The Man No One Believed is about the brutal murder of Harold and Thelma Swain, who were gunned down inside the Rising Daughter Baptist Church in 1985. It was a brutal, brutal murder in Camden County. And the case remained cold for a really long time. But what I want to ask you is, who is the man no one believed?
Yeah. So this case, I'll say, you mentioned that it went cold for many years. It went cold for 15 years. Then there was a cold case investigation started. This was the late 90s when cold cases were first starting to be kind of a thing across the country. And the idea was that, we have new technology and everything that could help us solve these cold cases. Well, what they did in this case was not use any of that technology and used, sort of ham-fisted old school police tactics. And they ended up secretly paying a person to testify that a man named Dennis Perry, who had lived in the area, grown up in the area, told her that he was going to do it before it even happened. And Dennis did not get to know that she was paid secretly $12,000. And he was steadfast from the very beginning. He was cleared by the original investigators in 1985, then brought back out of the blue as a suspect again. And so and that's just 15 years into the story, and we got 40 years that's still developing. You'll have to read the book for the rest, but I'll tell you, when that conviction happened, Dennis Perry was innocent. He was innocent on the night of the crime. He was innocent all the way. He's still innocent today. But he was the man that no one believed, because he had so many people, he had so much evidence to go for his innocence. But there was a big want to close the case. The local sheriff was one of the more colorful and, we'll say, corrupt sheriffs that Georgia had at the time. And he was very interested in having the case closed. Now, there are other people in this case who were not quite believed, including a man, and I haven't mentioned, I don't think, that this happened at Rising Daughter Baptist Church, which is a historic African-American church in Camden County. This is a church that started shortly after the Civil War, and it's been there ever since. The gunman was a white gunman, and in the want to close this, the police and prosecutors overlooked another man who had been saying that he did it and using racial slurs while describing doing it. But he had an alibi that kept them from looking at him. So sometimes you could say, well, he's the one no one believed. It gives, it really shows you the enormous consequences that can take place after, just based on who the authorities choose to believe.
That's so interesting. And this is a question that it's a heavy question, and for both, because both of these stories are about race and religion. Leo Frank was a Jewish man living in a predominantly Christian world. Thelma and Harold Swain were black folks living in a predominantly white county, and the man was a white shooter. But I want to know from you both, what did race have to do with the story, and how, in what ways, take us back to the time. So for you, it's like a long time ago, Anne, 1915. And, for you, it's 1985. And set the table of what we're talking about and what was looked at in terms of these cases back then.
Go for it. Well, the murder that took place at the pencil factory downtown, which was the National Pencil Company, took place on April the 26th, 1913. Leo Frank, number one, was from the North. He was a very educated man, and he was Jewish. So that's 3 strikes, because it would have been very tough on him being from the North. That probably was the biggest strike he had against him at that time in 1913. And then the fact that he was an engineer by trade. He was a mechanical engineer, but he was a superintendent of the plant. So he had a very hard time communicating with people. He's very introverted. So that, being as intelligent as he was and not being able to communicate with people and talk, as freely as we were used to being in the South, made them think he was kind of uppity. And then, of course, being Jewish was not the greatest, even though the Jewish community had been pretty well accepted in Atlanta at that time, but that it did not help his case being that way. And then he was the last person to see Mary Fagan alive. She came in to pick up her $1.20 paycheck that day, and he didn't even know her name. He knew her by an employee number. That's how he would pay her. Normally, she would have gotten her pay the night before, but she'd been laid off, and she had to come in the day of the Confederate parade. She had to come in and pick up her pay that day. And the last thing he can remember is hearing her walk down the steps after she had left and got her pay. But he was accused later on that night. She was found in the basement of the pencil factory, and they couldn't. So had he answered the phone that night, it probably would have been a whole lot better for him, but he didn't. He lived in a very big house, and he lived upstairs. He was upstairs, and they had one phone, which was in the back of the house. He never heard it ring. So they held that against him too. So he really never had a chance. And then you had a police. At the time, the police department was not the best. They made things work the way they wanted to make them work most of the time. It was a very corrupt time, and I'm just repeating what other people have repeated. And then there was a prosecutor, Hugh Dorsey, who he had aspirations to be much further in his career than he was, but he needed one good case. He'd already had one good case, but he lost it. So this was his second chance, and he had every intention of making that happen, and winning it. So it didn't matter to him who it was. He had to find somebody. He had to make him pay for it. So why not a Jewish man from the North?
Yeah, and the dynamics in the case that I wrote this book about certainly involved race big time. As I mentioned, this is a historic African-American church. Suddenly a white gunman shows up and kills a deacon and his wife and leaves them dead in the vestibule, escapes into the night. This was 30 years before the racist massacre in Charleston. But, so it was shades of that. But the gunman in Charleston had, written all sorts of things and made it very clear what he was doing. The man there had been rather cryptic. But the way race played into it was, you can go back and look at the newspaper articles, and none of them mentioned that this is a historic African-American church. Hardly any of them even described the gunman. The only publication, there was only one local paper that mentioned that it was an African-American church. The news didn't talk about this. Nobody was talking about, could this have been a hate crime? This is 1985. We're not far removed at all from the heat of the civil rights movement. And, we were still in it, frankly. But there was a want, and, I say this as somebody who is from Southeast Georgia. And I love Southeast Georgia. But Southeast Georgia's got a lot of problems and a lot of ways that, frankly, people who look like me for many years wanted to not talk about the sins of the past, the sins of the forefathers especially. And there was a want for this to not be racially motivated, I think. And I certainly, one of the things, but also you have to think about who was investigating the crime. The two lead investigators of this crime were white. I would say, though, these guys really did not appreciate racism, certainly in the conversations I've had with them. But they were a bit naive, and they later would say that. They were looking at it from, well, we grew up in segregated schools all the way. Then we had this. Then, as we were kids, as they were kids, they saw the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. Good things happening. They thought maybe maybe this isn't it. Maybe we're past that. As naive as that sounds in 1985. And part of it was who the victims were. The victims were, Harold Swain. I like to say, if this little community had a mayor, it probably would have been Harold Swain. He was 66 years old. He was a retired pulpwooder. And most people knew him as the friendly man who helped you down at the Choo Choo Barbecue and the attached gas station, or as the church member who was just all the time stopping by people's houses, asking if he could help with anything. And his wife was this caring person. And there was a thought among the detectives that, well, why would even a racist want to go after these folks? And I think that's just, wasn't understanding racism, certainly. They also investigated this man who's a purported white supremacist, named Eric Spar, who a year after the murders bragged on tape that he's the one who did it. But he had an alibi. And if I could just digress just real quick, I decided, because I'm from down there, when I started looking into this case, I heard there was a guy who was supposedly a white supremacist who had told his first and second ex-wives that he's the one who did it. And I thought about some of the people I had met growing up and some of the people I had bumped into in bars. And I thought, well, if one of those people were going around saying they did something like that, I might be inclined to try to believe them, At that moment, Eric Spar was the man no one believed, but I started to maybe believe him a little bit. And he had this alibi that said he was working at a grocery store. Well, I found out that alibi was given to the police by a person who was made up from thin air. It was given to them by a man who supposedly was his boss. The name, birthday, social security number, even the work phone number. None of these match anybody. The work phone number is some woman's house in Brunswick. And, shows you the price of what can happen when you believe too quickly in certain instances as well. Yeah,
that's one of the things that struck me as you talked about, the different investigators along the way too, and just how, you can get tunnel vision and decide that's the direction that you're going in. And I personally think that it would be hard to be an investigator and not do that, because you want so much to solve the case, or you just believe so entirely in your own theories, and it's, of course, super dangerous. Yeah. Yeah,
and I was just going to say, especially in these cases we're talking about, in 1985, and if you were a homicide investigator in 1985, bless your heart, because you were trying to be a miracle worker, right? Didn't have DNA testing, didn't know about so many different things, didn't have the trails that we all leave right now. If we pulled out if one of us went missing, and our phone was found, they could find everywhere we'd been. Well, none of that was the case in 1985. And I'd love to hear you talk maybe about what it was like in 1915,
Because you would have, with that, there was no DNA. There was barely, we had talked in the green room, Mary's autopsy, she had 3 autopsies all done on top of her grave. She'd be buried. The first, had her autopsy done, put back in the grave, dug her up, and did another autopsy, buried her again, and then did the third autopsy. All of them done on top of her grave in the cemetery. So yeah, I mean, in 1913 through 1915, there was nothing. There was nothing. Literally, you would have just had to have had witnesses, and that is where our famous witness here, who happened to be a black man, his name was Jim Conley, who was a man who had lived through the 1906 race. They called it riots, but it was not a riot. And he knew this score. His mother had taught him, you tell everyone what they need to hear. Anybody that's white, you tell them what they need to hear. So he has 3 different statements in the whole deal before he even becomes a witness on the stand. But you can't say he's the one that did it, because, he was going to tell every statement. He's telling Hugh Dorsey what he wants to hear. The questions are being fed to him, and he answers back what they wanted to hear. So there's no way, other than having had DNA, you would not have been able to find out who actually killed Mary Fagan.
Yeah, it was a good time to be a criminal back then. Not so much today. So I just wanted to pivot a little bit and talk about both of your stories are deeply Georgia stories. And, so much so that place is almost like another character or characters in your books. And so I want to talk about, and I, as someone who's a former travel guidebook writer and somebody who just cares deeply about how place plays into socioeconomics, politics, cultural norms. How did place figure into, and if you could describe, I'll start with you, Joshua, describe what we're talking about, where we're talking about for people who aren't familiar.
Yeah, so we're talking about southeast Georgia, particularly the Camden County, sometimes the Brunswick area, which is right near the north end of Camden County where this happened. And this is it's a very beautiful and evocative place. You're really near to beautiful spreading forest, but also near to the beach, near to the salt marshes. And the salt marshes, I used to love, on sunset drives, you would be able to see just kaleidoscopic colors above you. And, I grew up in Waycross, not very far from where all this happened, 40 minutes from my childhood home to the front door of this church. And I've always really loved the natural beauty there. It is a place that's butts up to the Okefenokee Swamp. So when I was growing up, we played in the woods, which was the swamp, and all of that just means so much to me. And also the place meant so much to the people in the story. One detail that really struck me and has always stayed with me is that I grew up on the Satilla River, or near the Satilla River. We couldn't afford to be on the Satilla River, but near it, And so did Harold Swain. So did Thelma Swain. So did Dennis Perry, the innocent man who went to prison. So did even Eric Spar, the man who I investigated, and by the way, was charged with the murders and goes on trial next month, 40 years later, for the church murders. And we're all connected by this place, right? And we're connected by the sociology of it, the myths of it, the feelings that we all carry around about it. And it seemed just so important to me the book would be naked if you didn't have that there, Yeah.
Yeah, it feels sweaty and swampy, and
it is.
And there's a lot of corruption and Harold Swain was also participating in the local NAACP at a time that, spicy time in terms of politics in that area. And so I just feel, you can feel that place matters. And so for you, Anne, you've got Milledgeville, Atlanta, Marietta in the I keep saying 1915, but I'm sorry, it's 1913. So tell us about what those places were like then.
Well, it was just, a little over 50 years from the Civil War. So that was very much still on everybody's mind. It was the convict leasing, which was just another form of slavery, had supposedly ended in 1908, but turned into chain gang, which again was another form of slavery. So, and then you had the migration of farmers coming into the city to work at the industrial plants, the pencil factory being one of them. Child's labor was a very big deal at the time. And the governor who commuted Leo Frank was actually ran on keeping child labor in place because which to me was another form of slavery because they made next to nothing and they wanted those children because of their little fingers and and they could get away with it. And so there was a lot of families there of those children that wanted child labor to continue because that's how they put food on the table. So you've got that whole atmosphere going on. Then you've got Milledgeville, which is about 120 miles south of Marietta, where the penitentiary used to be the old capital, and Leo was moved there and to just give you an example, when the mob, and they called him a mob, and so when you think of mob, you think of, loud and forcing their way in. They never fired a shot. The guards, there were 2 tower guards, they opened the gate and let them through. They were there all of 10 minutes. And there was no yelling, screaming, except for the warden's wife, who was very upset that he was going to be killed. And she was yelling and screaming. Other than that, there was no kind of conflict that took place. It was so well planned out. And they took Leo and they left. And they took a long way home. They came up around through Eatonton, up through Cummings, and through Alpharetta. So, you've got all these people watching. They knew what was going on. They knew my great-grandfather was one of them who knew what they were doing when they came through Cummings. He knew what was taking place. So there was a lot of complicity that took place with that. So all of that is part of, and then we won't even talk about Marietta because the biggest majority, there was the masterminds of him being kidnapped, which were some of the biggest government officials in the state that just happened to be in Marietta. And they chose 25 hand-chosen people to do the work for them because, of course, they couldn't do it. So a place definitely, was a big part of this story because that complicity of, I didn't see anything. You can read newspaper articles where they were asked, the neighbors around there, the day of the lynching, did you hear anything? Did you see anything? Well, this is the morning of a work morning. And there's 7 cars, 6 by that point, 6 cars coming in and parking in front of this grove of trees over here. But nobody saw anything or noticed it. Most people didn't have a car. So, there was the complicity that took place and in all 3 of those places. So it's almost like a character, the place is.
Just as a follow-up, tell us what, this book is about Lucille Frank. What was it like for women at that time in those places? Well,
women were definitely marginalized. They couldn't have an opinion. Lucille stepped out and had an opinion. She wrote before the trial started. She could see where everything was going. And she wrote 2 letters. The first letter she wrote to all 3 of the newspapers to Hugh Dorsey, who was the prosecutor, and said, you were trying to bamboozle my husband just because he's a Jew. You want to get him. And it's not fair. And this is what you've done. And this is what you've done. And this is what you've done. And he comes back and writes the next day because that was, the newspaper was like our TV and internet now. And he comes back the next day with his letter and says, oh, you poor woman. It must be horrible to understand that your husband's a murderer, and totally blew her off. Instead of being quiet, she sits right back down she writes another letter, sends it in, and she says, no, but let's get back to the subject, which is, this is what you're doing. And of course he backed down and didn't say anything else. And that for him, but she was on his radar and he would love to have gotten rid of her. He did try to get her her and Leo's mom out of the trial, attending the trial, because he was afraid of them. So, it was a hard time to be a woman in that time, for sure.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to pivot again and talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of writing and researching stories like these. And I've heard you both reference the newspapers, and I certainly used a lot of previous people's reporting in researching my book. And sometimes I wonder, in this day and age of internet, what happens to all of that? Does it, I know it still exists, but there's something about touching black and white newspaper or reading stories that give you context around what else is happening at the time. But tell me about the challenges of, Anne, your book has a lovely photo spread right in the middle of all these incredible photographs of Leo and his family, and Lucille's family. And Josh, as a journalist, you've definitely done a lot of research. Tell me about the research process. What was it like? What were your challenges in digging up these stories?
Well, needless to say, everything was letters back then. We don't write letters now, but everything was letters. And so you would write a letter across town to someone instead of picking up the phone, even though Lucille did have a phone, but there was still much letter writing going on. So if not for letters, I don't know how I would have even found out who Lucille really was. The very beginning, when I said, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it nonfiction, I thought, oh, this is not going to be bad. And then I thought, where do I start? Because she's not there, I can't see her anywhere. And I started with letters, thank goodness for historical societies and the people that save things, that's what helped me. And I read letters, just everyday letters. You could be surprised what you learn from a shopping list, about somebody. And that helped tremendously. The newspapers, like I said, was like TV and the internet. During the trial, they covered everything verbatim. The newspaper would have, the whole, it was like a transcript of court. And the only time they didn't cover it verbatim was when Jim Conley, one of the days that he actually testified, and because of the content of it, it was too sexual, so they didn't put that in there. But the transcripts had disappeared. The real transcripts for the court had disappeared. And so you couldn't find those, but we did have the brief of evidence, and then we had the newspaper, so I could go through that. But it was a lot I didn't even have anybody really to interview, because we're talking about 1913 through 1915, so I didn't have anybody to interview. It was mostly historians that had already done some history on it, but it was just grunt work. It took me 10 years of research to get to with this book.
Well, I had a slightly easier time 60 years later, but it was still rather difficult. I will say that one thing that helped was, there's an enormous amount of police records, court records. There had been some newspaper stories, but as somebody who has written a lot of newspaper stories that were immediately after an event, I can tell you that you can't take them all as gospel. So I'm careful about that, because you go with the reporters, the best of them are going with the best that they have. They call it the first draft of history. That draft is meant to be completed, another draft, so that's not supposed to be just what you believe. So I really leaned on things that I knew I could hold on to. When this terrible, terrible double murder happened in the church, there were about 13 people there. One was a little girl. All but Harold Swain were women. They were there for a Bible study and mission department meeting of the church, and every one of those people was interviewed on tape afterward. So I had all of their interviews I didn't have the tapes; those had been lost, but I had the transcripts. Those were enormously helpful in putting back together what happened in the church that night. And I did luckily have people I could interview. But even those folks were, clawing back through decades in their minds to try to find the answers to these questions. And that is just really difficult because I don't know about y'all, but I forget things from yesterday all the time. I forget why I walked into a room half the time. I'm at the house. I'm like, I got to get something. No, I don't. Okay. Yeah. But we're talking about something that was when I started looking into it 35 years prior. One thing that was helpful is there had been, a podcast done, looking into the case. And that podcast, it was called Undisclosed, and they did a stellar job uncovering so much. I told you about the secret reward that the witness was paid. They uncovered that. And it was gave me sort of like a bit of a roadmap in a way, if say I want to talk to somebody, I don't know, TJ Howard, I'm making this person up. I want to talk to TJ, but he's already talked to the Undisclosed and I can tell he knows nothing about anything. So I probably don't need to waste my time there. So it helped me sort of focus my reporting. And one thing they had not focused on was this guy, Eric Spar, like I mentioned. But the passage of time is a huge, huge issue, to a writer. And especially when we're talking about we'll certainly talking about true events, especially traumatic events, things that ended people's lives, things that damaged profoundly people's lives. It's a lot of pressure, to get everything right. So I do it, I did it here, just like, Ann did, years of work that you all would probably, if you saw me doing it, you would think I'm doing nothing, but I'm reading, I'm ruminating. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Like a writer.
But that is often the life of a writer. It's, or investigative journalist, reading way more than most people do of documents that nobody would ever want to read, going to talk to people with the process, knowing that they may slam the door in your face. That certainly happened to me in this case. And there's something about, when you feel like you're on the right track, Anne's saying that she's starting to see Mrs. Frank come alive in these letters, and I'm starting to feel all of it come alive too. And that's really, really what we want to do, is bring it to life. So.
That's amazing. So one thing I want to talk about, we're going to transition in about 5 minutes to questions. So start thinking about your questions. I want to talk about justice. So both of your books are about, unfairly accused men in different ways, obviously. And then, so how does writing these books help right the wrongs? And, so, Anne, I noticed in your book, towards the end, you write that her life, Lucille's life, in many ways stopped when Leo was lynched. And, how does telling her story, releasing it into the world, making it a part of history now, how does that help right the wrong? Or does it?
I'm not sure it helps right the wrong, but it keeps it fresh in our mind because, history just repeats itself. And you can take Lucille's story and you can put it in modern day times, and things are still happening like this. They're still happening. The young couple in New York who was at the reception and came out of the reception and were the Jewish couple, and they were going to get married and were shot just for the simple fact and killed because they were Jewish. I mean, there's this, it goes on and it doesn't stop. And so for me, it was letting people know that Lucille was a victim. She was a victim that never really recovered afterwards. One of the reasons why I've had a lot of people ask me, why did you name an I Am a Georgia Girl? Her last her very last statement to the public after Leo was lynched was, and you need to look it up, it's a chilling statement. But she opens it with, "I am a Georgia girl." And it was her way of reminding the people that she called them the designing persons, the ones that planned it, that she and her family helped Atlanta grow to what Atlanta had been. She was a Georgia girl before she was Jewish. She was born and raised in Georgia, and she wanted them to remember that. Before that, she was very progressive, and she always signed her name Lucille Frank. After that, she was always Mrs. Leo M. Frank, and it was her way of always making people understand what had happened to her husband, and she did recover. I mean, she went on. She never married. She had a life, but it wasn't the life that she ever planned on having because of what had taken place. So she was just as much a victim as Leo was and as Mary was, just in a different way. And justice, I don't know that I could give her justice other than giving her a voice. And she was so private, I really worried about doing this, but I just felt like people needed to know who she was. Young women need to know who she was. I'll get up on my soapbox now, but she was such a strong woman. All of this took place and was over with when she was 26.
Wow.
I have a 26-year-old daughter, and I can't even imagine. She fought for her husband. She went out there and did whole page ads all over the country asking people to sign, to cut out the little thing in the paper and sign it to the governor to save her husband's life. I say that if she hadn't have beaten the path like she had of, John Slayton might not have ever, even though if there's a hero in this, it's John Slayton, but he might not have ever taken the time to really look at it, because he had aspirations to be much bigger than the governor of Georgia. And he knew if he took it on and he didn't do what the people wanted, he would not be in the political arena anymore. And yet he did take it on. He did look at it, and he did commute his death sentence to life only because he knew if he commuted him completely, they would kill him. So that's why he did it to life. That way, when he would have a chance to prove his innocence, because he did not believe that he was guilty. So if there is a justice here, and a hero, he was the one that did, him and Lucille, and so giving them a voice was, to me, the only justice I could give to Lucille, and I tried to do that.
It's amazing. Thank you for telling her story. So, Joshua, your investigation into the story helped lead to the exoneration of Dennis Perry. In 2020, at the age of 58, Perry was released for being wrongly imprisoned for 20 years. And Mr. Perry is here today. So, Mr. Perry, could you stand up?
And his wife Brenda's right next to him.
Thank you so much for being here. And if you could talk a little bit about, your relationship and why he's here, how you're here, and yeah.
Yeah, well, I'd never heard of him until this case, obviously. But when you talk about justice, he is obviously one of the first people who comes to mind, in this case. He did not get justice. The system, as I've heard him put it many times, finally did the right thing. But for 20 years, the system did something so wrong that, I'm 38 years old now. He was 38 when he was arrested in the year 2000. I think about, I'd like y'all to think about the next 20 years of your life goes away. You lose it. You're in prison, and it is not a place where you can be yourself. It's not a place where you can have emotions. Dennis is a very lovely guy, a very talkative guy, friendly guy. So many people from my part of the world our emotions are not hidden. They're right here. But he suffered through that in prison, and somehow has come out and walks around with a smile on his face. And it's really powerful to me, and it's inspiring to me every day. When I think about, how bad I got it today, all these just junk I got going on in my life, and, think a bit about Dennis, like, well, okay, never mind. I'm going to be all right. If Dennis can smile, then I can at least get up and do something today, And I think it speaks to his character. I think it also speaks to the, frankly, lunacy of thinking that he was the one who did it to begin with, because he had no record of going around and being violent of any kind. Everybody described him and said he's a lovely guy. And amazingly, after 20 years of out and out torture, it's got to feel like a kidnapping. Still is that lovely guy, It's really amazing to me. And I would love for some of y'all to say hey to him outside. He's a great people person. So.
Dennis, your book's going to come out soon, right? One day.
Y'all be looking for Dennis, the autobiography of Dennis Perry next. I don't know what he'll call it, but that's why.
So if anybody's got any questions, this is a great time to you can come up to the mic, because I think they're filming it. So that's the only way they hear the question.
For Josh, you did a lot of investigating in this case for a long time as a reporter. As an author, how much investigating and research did you have to do to write this book?
That's a good question. After a while of reporting this stuff, I started reporting on this when I was a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And that's where the original story is published. And I did a lot of follow-up stories. And I was so quickly, I don't want to even describe the feelings that my editor had when she saw how long my first draft was. I thought I was in trouble. Big time. Like, whatever the findings are, why is it 11,000 words? I was always having more than I could use. And I made sure after a while I started thinking, this is bigger than these articles. There's so many more things I want to say. This not only is something that is interesting to me and interesting to people, who are connected to it. This is a serious part of Georgia history that has been, pretty well forgotten about. I didn't know about it. It happened the year before I was born, but still, I thought I would have heard about it being from around there. So I did a lot more than made it in the paper. And then I did, even more, with the book, which was just, it was great to me. I deeply, I was deeply moved by the journey I got to go on with this reporting. And, it's difficult to make it stop. Honestly, this guy, Eric Sparr, I mentioned, goes on trial next month. I'm trying to figure out, and I live in Detroit. I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do of covering it, So when the paperback comes out, there will be a forward, or an afterward, probably with some of that. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Josh, you've written about institutions that fail the people they're meant to protect. As a reporter, how do you balance exposing systemic failure with recognizing that most people inside those systems are trying to do good work under impossible pressure?
That's a very, very good question. Coming from you, I know what you're talking about. But, there are, I'll give you the example of covering, defects cases and defects failures that I've covered through the years at the AJC. And there will be, we can look at the result of what happens in those cases. Children die and terrible, terrible things happen. And the first thing people want to do is just, let's go run, find everybody who touched it and fire them immediately, and then we'll be fine. What we should do in these cases is what I try to encourage in the stories is, not just look for, 10 pounds of flesh, look for answers, look for new ways to train, new ways to think of things. Don't just suddenly, slam the door on this, that, or the other, or start taking all the children into foster care, because that isn't going to be the answer, So it's just, the balance is really making sure that it's the more explosive the thing you want to reveal about an organization to the public, the more care you need to take into mitigating what could be rush to judgment, over correction for that,
Hey there, all. My name is Brad, and I read your book. Yeah, I came to your little talk. Yeah, I had the leopard pants on, and you said, hey, where'd you get those pants? My question is for you. I'm sorry, I forgot your name again. Ann. I'm Brad Ann. And so, like you, my grandfather and great-grandfather went to the lynch site and saw the body hanging from the tree. So my great-grandfather he was also a Civil War veteran. So my grandfather was born later in his life. So they went, and it never was talked about in my family. If anybody ever brought it up, they changed the subject, So they just, like yours, probably just went as spectators, as they all did back in the day. Right. So my question to you is, were you able to find any of the Zelig or Frank descendants to talk to, or did you speak to any of the Fagan family about any of this before you wrote what you wrote?
I did not speak to the Fagan family. I did reach out. Mm-hmm. They didn't care to speak to me. The only Lucille part of the family that I knew was alive, I knew was very private. And so I had put a little feelers out, but I knew that wasn't going to work really well. So I had turned in the manuscript, and I have a bookseller that, unless I'm somewhere like this, that follows me around, and she had sent me a email on New Year's Eve and said, "This is for real, Ann." Mm-hmm. I checked it out. I'm not sending you somebody crazy. And it was Lucille's great nephew.
Was that Clark?
No, this was Chuck.
Okay.
Chuck Marcus, or Charles Marcus. Mm-hmm. He was Sarah, her oldest sister. Mm-hmm. It was grandson.
Yeah.
Okay. And he wanted to talk to me. Mm-hmm. And of course the book was already in edits, but I hadn't done the edits yet. And so of course I wanted to speak to him, and I did talk to him quite a bit. And then he asked me, he said, I want you to come to my house and bring a truck and bring your husband. I thought, okay, what's this about? And so I went. I did go. We brought the truck, and I brought my husband, and he gave me Lucille's writing desk. She had left it to his mom, and he had talked to the whole family, and they agreed that I should have the desk, because
how cool is that?
For once that they had given her a voice. They hadn't read the book now, so I thought, oh God, whether they read it and they hate it. I mean, but I did just hear from them recently. And Chuck and I have talked quite a bit, and he would be here, but he got COVID. He's 86. He got COVID, so he couldn't be here, but he's come to every one of my.
Yeah. And I believe Clark Howard is Lucille's great nephew. Clark Howard from WSB, is that right?
I don't know.
I think that's right.
I don't know. That's a good.
I think that's right.
I find something out at every place I go that I don't.
You might want to reach out to him.
That's a good idea. Yeah. Thank you.
I think we've got time for one final question. Take your time.
And I wanted to ask you. You said that Governor Slayton was the real hero, and I know he commuted Frank's sentence a few days before he was leaving office. What happened to him after he left office? Was he out of politics?
He was out of politics completely. The town, he secreted Leo away in the middle of the night because he knew that this was the end of everything. And everybody went crazy, and they threatened the governor's mansion, and he was having none of it. You know, they said, you can't go. And he had some kind of luncheon he was supposed to go to, and they said, you can't go to that. He said, I most certainly will. You know, I'm not going to run scared. I've done what I feel is the right thing. They voted me in to do what I thought was the right thing. And he said, I've looked at all this and I thought it was the right thing. He did leave the state and did not come back for several years, but he never was in politics again. It was over. He knew it was going to be over when he did it, and it was over. So to me, he's, you know, you don't see many people that would give that kind of sacrifice to do the right thing. And so I thought he's one of the heroes. He didn't have to. He could have just said, you know what, I'm not doing this. Mm-hmm. You know, so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think that about gives us the end of our time. Both Ann and Joshua are going to be out to sign books and talk to people. And actually, I think Dennis is going to stick around and talk to people if you have questions for him.
He's better at it than me anyway.
Thank you all very much for coming.